So yesterday I shared a little bit about how Congress makes tax laws. It's not the IRS who writes the tax code. Just to recap that, Congress writes the tax laws. The Treasury Department will interpret those through Treasury regulations, which are authoritative. And then the IRS will put out other publications that are not authoritative, but are meant to help you understand their position on what they believe the tax law and Treasury regulations mean, as well as help you understand how to comply with them. So it is not the IRS that we should blame if we don't like the way something is in the tax code. They're basically just doing their job. Let's blame Congress if we don't like a tax law. Now, that also means that the IRS's perspective and what they put in instructions and revenue procedures, these are not authoritative like the Treasury regulations and the actual tax code are. So that means that you can disagree with the IRS. What happens if you disagree with the IRS? The IRS is going to enforce what they think they can do. And if you disagree with them, you have to petition the tax court. You have to take the IRS to tax court if you cannot come to an agreement with them on something specific as it relates to your taxes. The tax court will then interpret the tax law and they will rule whether or not you or the IRS is correct. There are some things where the IRS, their interpretation has been upheld by the tax court over and over and over and over again. I do not recommend that you argue with the IRS in these matters because the tax court has already settled them. The IRS is right. Now, also, for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of situations, you're probably going to want to go with the IRS's perspective and their interpretation. Look, the IRS does this all the time. They've been doing it for a very long time and they train their people fairly well. Of course, you can find the exception to that. For most people, taking the instructions to the tax form, taking the revenue rulings, the revenue procedures, taking publications that the IRS puts out, going with the IRS's interpretation of the tax law is probably the right thing for you in almost every situation. There are tax law items that are unclear. Even the IRS hasn't necessarily put guidance out yet because they're not sure about how it will be interpreted by the court. And so with those situations, that is more of a gray area where as long as you can take a reasonable stance, you won't be penalized for that stance. You might lose your position in tax court if it goes there, but you won't go to jail for doing something fraudulent. But the IRS might disagree with you. They might take it to tax court to see how the court is going to interpret it. That's just a little bit more into, the tax code and how much authority the IRS actually has and who decides if you disagree with the IRS, who's right. The tax court does.